Welcome, my friends. Tonight we're stepping into shadows, an era of disease, divine wrath, and survival by any means necessary. We're exploring the brutal reality of medieval life, stripped of its romantic veneer. This isn't the sanitized version you've seen in films. This is raw, unforgiving history where death lurked around every corner. If this kind of deep dive resonates with you, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe, but only if it feels genuine. I'm curious to know where you are in the world right now and what time you're watching this. There's something compelling about knowing we're all gathered here from different corners of the globe, united by curiosity about our past. Get your pillows, dim your surroundings, maybe let some ambient sound fill the background. We're about to descend into a world where comfort was a luxury few could afford. You open your eyes to darkness so complete, it feels like a physical weight pressing against your face. The air in your small cottage is thick with the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and something else, the perpetual mustiness of wool that never quite dries, of straw that's been slept on too many nights, of bodies that bathe perhaps once a month if fortune smiles upon them. You are a peasant in the village of Little Wickham, somewhere in the rolling hills of what will one day be called the English countryside, and it is the year 1347. The Black Death has not yet arrived to reshape your world, but already life moves to rhythms so foreign to modern sensibilities that you might as well be living on another planet entirely. The cottage around you measures perhaps 12 feet by 16, smaller than most modern bedrooms. You share this space with your wife, 3 children who survived past their second birthdays, your elderly mother, and during winter months, sometimes a pig or goat brought inside to prevent them from freezing. The walls are made of wattle and daub, wooden frames filled with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung that has dried to a consistency somewhere between concrete and clay. When it rains heavily, small rivulets of brown water sometimes trickle down these walls, carrying with them the earthy smell of decomposition and renewal. Your bed is not a bed as you might imagine it, but rather a wooden frame strung with rope, topped with a mattress stuffed with straw, feathers if you've been particularly fortunate, or more often, whatever plant material could be gathered and dried. The straw pokes through the rough linen covering, creating a landscape of small irritations against your skin. You share this sleeping surface with your wife and youngest child, while the older children sleep on smaller pallets arranged around the single room. Privacy is not a concept that exists in your vocabulary, nor in your experience. The rhythm of your life begins before dawn, as it has for generations before you and as it will for generations after. There are no clocks in Little Wickham. Indeed, there are precious few clocks anywhere in England. Time moves to the rhythm of seasons, of sunrise and sunset, of church bells that ring out the canonical hours across fields where crops grow in strips allocated by custom and feudal obligation. You wake when your body tells you the night has grown thin, when some internal mechanism calibrated by years of agricultural labour whispers that dawn approaches. The darkness around you is not the manageable darkness of a modern home, where electric switches wait to banish night with the flip of a finger. This is medieval darkness, profound, complete, and expensive to dispel. Candles are luxuries saved for special occasions or true emergencies. Most evenings, your family sits around a small fire, doing what work can be done by flickering light until eyes grow too strained to continue. Then you sleep, because there is little else to do, and fuel is too precious to waste on extending day into night. You rise from your bed, feeling the familiar ache in joints that have known hard labour since childhood. Your body tells the story of your life in ways that would astonish modern people. Your spine curved slightly from years of bending over crops, your hands bearing the permanent stains and calluses of agricultural work, your skin weathered by sun and wind into something resembling leather more than flesh. At 32 years old, you are considered middle-aged, though you hope to see perhaps another 20 years if God wills it and if disease, famine or warfare do not intervene. The morning air carries sounds that punctuate the pre-dawn stillness with gentle insistence. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crows, not the cheerful cartoon sound of children's stories, but a harsh, primitive call that seems to tear through the darkness like fabric. From the cottage next to yours, you can hear the soft murmur of your neighbour already moving about, the quiet scrape of wooden implements against earthen floors, the rustle of straw as bodies shift and wake. Your feet touch the packed earth floor, cold and slightly damp despite the season. Rushes have been scattered across this surface, mixed with herbs when available, to provide some cushioning and to absorb the various liquids and debris that accumulate in a space where cooking, eating, sleeping, and most other life activities occur in close proximity. These rushes crunch softly under your weight, releasing a green smell that mingles with the cottage's more permanent aromas. Through a small window, really more of an opening covered with oiled cloth, you can see the first suggestion of dawn touching the horizon. The sky lightens from black to deep grey, and you know that soon the village will come alive with the ancient choreography of agricultural survival. Your day will unfold according to patterns established long before your birth, guided by seasonal necessities and feudal obligations that govern your existence as surely as natural law. You reach for your clothes, the same rough woolen tunic and hose you've worn for the past several days. Washing clothes is a laborious process involving hauling water, heating it over fire, and using precious soap made from animal fat and ash. Most garments are worn until they become unbearably dirty or until the weekly or bi-weekly washing day arrives. Your tunic is the colour of undyed wool, a greyish-brown that hides stains well and requires no expensive dyes that remain luxuries for those with substantial means. The cottage around you represents not just your home, but your entire world in many ways. You were born within a few miles of this spot, as were your parents and their parents before them. Travel beyond the immediate area requires permission from your lord, and such permission is rarely granted except for essential business like market days or religious festivals. Your universe consists of perhaps a dozen similar cottages, the manor house where your lord lives, fields that stretch to the horizon in carefully managed strips, a church that serves as both spiritual and social centre, and perhaps a mill where grain is ground into flour. As you dress in the pre-dawn gloom, your movements careful and quiet to avoid waking the rest of your family too early, you prepare to step into another day of medieval existence. The sun has not yet risen, but already you can feel the weight of obligations and necessities that will fill every hour until darkness returns. Your life moves to rhythms dictated by soil and season, by feudal duty and religious calendar, by the constant struggle to extract enough sustenance from the earth to keep death at bay for another day, another season, another year. Outside your cottage, Little Wickham waits in the growing light. A small community bound together by shared hardship, common faith, and the ancient knowledge that survival depends not on individual achievement, but on collective effort guided by traditions passed down through generations of your ancestors who faced the same daily challenge of wresting life from an often unforgiving world. Section 2. The Manor's Morning Rituals. You step outside your cottage into the crisp morning air, and immediately the complexity of your feudal world reveals itself in layers of obligation and hierarchy that will govern every aspect of your day. The village of Little Wickham exists not as an independent community, but as part of a carefully structured system that has evolved over centuries to organize human labor, distribute resources, and maintain social order in ways that would seem both fascinating and oppressive to modern minds. The manor house sits perhaps 300 yards from your cottage, visible through the morning mist as a substantial stone structure that represents not just wealth, but power over life and death itself. Sir Geoffrey de Montfort, your lord, controls not only the land you work, but your very movements, your children's futures, and your family's survival. This is not tyranny as you understand it. This is simply the natural order of things, as fixed and unchangeable as the rotation of seasons or the rising of the sun. As you walk toward the fields where your day's labour awaits, you pass other cottages stirring to life. Smoke begins to curl from holes in thatched roofs as cooking fires are rekindled from coals banked the night before. The process of starting a fire each morning represents a small but crucial victory against the constant threat of cold and hunger. Flint and steel are precious commodities, and the knowledge of how to nurse flame from spark is passed down with the same reverence given to religious instruction. Your neighbour, Edmund the miller, emerges from his cottage carrying a wooden bucket toward the communal well. His position in the village hierarchy places him slightly above your own. The mill represents one of the Lord's most valuable monopolies, and Edmund's family has operated it for 3 generations. Still, he nods to you with the easy familiarity of shared hardship. In a community where survival depends on cooperation, social distinctions matter less in daily interaction than they do in formal ceremonies or legal proceedings. The well around which much of village life revolves stands in the centre of Little Wickham, its wooden frame worn smooth by countless hands, drawing water for cooking, cleaning, and the endless needs of agricultural life. The water table here runs close to the surface, one of the reasons this particular spot was chosen for settlement generations ago. Water that appears clean and sweet can still carry diseases that will sweep through the village with devastating efficiency. But such knowledge lies centuries in the future. For now, you simply know that some wells produce water that keeps families healthy, while others seem cursed with sickness. As you approach the well, you can hear the first sounds of activity from the manor house itself. Sir Geoffrey maintains a household of perhaps 20 people, family members, servants, guards, and various craftsmen whose skills serve the entire manor. The rhythms of their day begin earlier than your own, as the complex business of managing feudal estates requires constant attention to detail, negotiation, and the delicate balance of local politics that keeps the system functioning. Church bells begin to ring across the countryside, marking prime, the first of the canonical hours that structure medieval time. These bells serve as the universal clock for your community, telling you not just when to pray, but when to begin work, when to pause for meals, and when to return home as darkness falls. The sound carries across fields and forest with a clarity that cuts through morning mist and connects your small village to a broader world of Christian observance that stretches from Ireland to Jerusalem. Your day officially begins with obligations that supersede personal choice or preference. 3 days each week, you owe labour service to Sir Geoffrey's domain, the portion of manor land worked directly for his benefit rather than divided among peasant families. Today is one of those days, which means your own strips of land, scattered across the village fields according to ancient custom, must wait while you contribute your strength to maintaining the Lord's prosperity. The domain fields stretch out before you in the growing light, organised according to the 3-field system that represents centuries of agricultural wisdom adapted to English soil and climate. One field lies fallow this year, recovering its fertility while grazing sheep whose manure will help restore nutrients to exhausted earth. The second field grows winter wheat planted last autumn, now standing knee-high and promising, if God wills it, sufficient grain to carry the manor through another year. The third field holds spring crops, oats, barley, and peas that will supplement the wheat harvest and provide fodder for the animals whose labour makes human survival possible. Walking toward the domain fields, you pass the manor's orchard, where apple and pear trees grow in neat rows maintained by Aldrich the gardener, whose knowledge of fruit cultivation makes him valuable enough to enjoy certain privileges denied to common field workers. Fruit represents more than nutrition in your medieval world. Properly preserved, it provides essential variety in winter diets, otherwise limited to grain, preserved meat, and whatever vegetables can be stored in root cellars dug deep enough to prevent freezing. The reeve approaches as you join other villagers gathering for the day's labour assignment. Walter the Reeve holds a position of considerable responsibility and corresponding anxiety, chosen by the villagers but answerable to Sir Geoffrey. He must balance the competing demands of feudal obligation and peasant survival. His weathered face bears the permanent worry lines of a man caught between two worlds, responsible for ensuring that the Lord's requirements are met while keeping his neighbours alive and productive. Walter carries a wooden staff that serves as both symbol of his authority and practical tool for measuring land, checking the depth of furrows, and occasionally encouraging reluctant workers. His literacy, the ability to scratch his name and keep basic records, sets him apart from most villagers and makes him indispensable to the manor's administration. Yet this same literacy burdens him with knowledge of debts, obligations, and legal requirements that weigh heavily on community resources. The morning air carries the scent of dampness rising from fields that have absorbed the night's dew, mixed with the earthy smells of animals and growing things that define the agricultural landscape. Horses and oxen are being led from their shelters toward the fields where ploughing, harrowing, and other heavy work await. These animals represent wealth beyond most peasant families' reach. A good plough horse costs more than a family's annual cash income, while oxen require feeding and care that only communal effort can sustain. As you take your place among the work gangs forming for the day's labour, you understand that your individual survival depends entirely on the success of collective effort. The failure of one family's harvest affects the entire community, just as the Lord's prosperity or hardship ripples through every cottage in Little Wickham. This interdependence creates both security and vulnerability. Security in knowing that community members will share resources during hard times. Vulnerability in knowing that disasters affecting the manor system threaten everyone within it. Such news matters because the Lord's family fortunes directly affect every peasant household, their prosperity or troubles rippling through the entire manor community in ways both subtle and profound. Old Henrik, whose weathered hands grip his hoe with the authority of long experience, tells stories of the great storm that struck when he was young Martin's age, when wind and hail destroyed nearly half the grain crop and forced the entire village to survive on stored reserves, supplemented by nuts, berries, and whatever small game could be caught without trespassing on the Lord's hunting preserves. These stories serve as both entertainment and education, passing down essential knowledge about surviving the catastrophes that periodically test medieval communities. The field around you reveals evidence of the careful agricultural science that sustains medieval civilization. Furrows run in precise lines, calculated to provide optimal drainage while preventing soil erosion during heavy rains. The spacing between rows reflects generations of observation about how much room each plant needs to reach full maturity without competing destructively with its neighbours. Even the timing of this work, breaking ground after spring rains but before the soil becomes too dry, demonstrates accumulated wisdom about working with natural cycles rather than fighting against them. As morning progresses toward midday, your work reveals the complex relationship between human labour and natural processes that defines agricultural existence. Each stroke of your hoe serves multiple purposes: loosening soil for planting, destroying weeds before they can establish themselves, creating channels for water drainage, and preparing seed beds that will determine whether this year brings abundance or scarcity to Little Wickham. Your individual effort contributes to collective survival in ways that connect your small actions to the broader success or failure of the entire community. The physical demands of this work would astonish modern people accustomed to sedentary occupations and mechanized assistance. Your body expends energy at rates that require substantial nutrition just to maintain basic function. Yet your diet consists primarily of bread, porridge, occasional vegetables, and small amounts of meat or dairy products when available. This constant tension between caloric expenditure and nutritional intake shapes not only your physical appearance, but your entire approach to daily life, making efficiency and endurance more valuable than speed or individual achievement. Around mid-morning, Walter calls for a brief rest, and you straighten your back with the careful attention of someone who must preserve physical capability for decades of similar labour. The other workers pause their efforts as well, some stretching muscles that protest the repetitive motion, others taking advantage of the break to sharpen tool edges or adjust handles worn loose by constant use. These small maintenance tasks represent essential skills that peasant families must master: the ability to repair and maintain tools, to recognize when iron edges need attention from the village smith, to judge when wooden handles require replacement before they fail at crucial moments. During this brief pause, you can survey the progress your group has made since dawn. Perhaps a quarter of your assigned section now shows the broken, loosened soil that indicates proper preparation for planting. The work proceeds at a steady pace that reflects not laziness or inefficiency, but rather the calculated effort of people who must sustain this level of activity for the entire growing season. Pushing too hard early in the day leads to exhaustion that reduces afternoon productivity, while working too slowly invites criticism from the reeve and potential punishment from manor officials. The landscape around you tells stories of human effort stretching back through generations of your ancestors. Stone walls mark field boundaries established decades ago, their careful construction representing countless hours of labour clearing rocks from arable land and creating barriers that will guide farming patterns for centuries. Ancient oak trees stand at field corners, their massive trunks bearing scars from agricultural implements and their spreading branches providing shade for workers during the hottest part of summer days. You return to your labour, as Walter signals the end of the rest period, your hoe resuming its steady rhythm against earth that yields reluctantly to human determination. The work continues with the patient persistence that characterizes all medieval agriculture, not dramatic or heroic in individual moments, but accumulating over time into the careful cultivation that separates civilized communities from wilderness, abundance from starvation, survival from the constant threat of catastrophe that shadows every peasant family's existence. The church bell tolls across the fields with the deep bronze voice that has marked the hours for your village since before your grandfather's birth. Its sound carries over the rolling landscape with an authority that transcends human command, calling the faithful to sext, the midday prayer that divides the working day into manageable portions. You pause in your labour, as do all the workers scattered across the domain fields, and remove your rough woolen cap in automatic observance of this moment when earthly toil yields briefly to spiritual obligation. The bell itself represents wealth beyond most peasant comprehension, cast in bronze by craftsmen whose skills command premium prices, blessed by bishops whose political influence reaches far beyond Little Wickham's boundaries, and mounted in a stone tower that required years of community labour to construct. Yet its daily voice serves the humblest cottager as faithfully as it serves Sir Geoffrey in his manor house, marking time with the democratic precision that governs agricultural communities where collective survival depends on coordinated effort. As the bell's reverberations fade across the countryside, you can hear similar bells answering from neighbouring villages, their bronze voices creating a network of temporal authority that stretches across the English landscape. This medieval internet of sound connects your small community to hundreds of others, all following the same rhythm of prayer and labour, all bound by the same seasonal cycles that have governed agricultural life since Roman legions first cleared these forests for cultivation. Walter the Reeve approaches your work gang with news that affects the afternoon's labour assignment. A messenger arrived at the manor house this morning, carrying word from Sir Geoffrey's overlord, requiring additional grain reserves to be prepared for transport, to support military obligations that ripple down through the feudal hierarchy. This means extra work threshing last year's remaining harvest, work that will extend today's obligations well past the usual evening bell. The messenger himself represents a glimpse into the broader world beyond Little Wickham's boundaries. Mounted on horseback, carrying letters sealed with wax and bearing insignia that proclaim aristocratic authority, he connects your isolated village to political networks spanning kingdoms. His presence reminds you that your local lord serves greater lords, who in turn owe obligations to the king himself, creating chains of dependency and authority that ultimately reach from your cottage to the royal court. Margaret wipes her brow with a piece of rough linen and shares gossip gleaned from her husband's service in the manor household. Lady Catherine has been suffering from the morning sickness that accompanies her pregnancy, requiring the attention of goodwife Ellen, whose knowledge of herbs and healing makes her invaluable to both noble and peasant families. Ellen's wisdom spans generations of accumulated knowledge about which plants ease pain, which promote healing, and which must be avoided during pregnancy, knowledge that often determines who lives and who dies in communities lacking access to formal medical training. The midday pause provides opportunity for the small meal that helps sustain workers through long hours of physical labour. You unwrap a portion of bread from the cloth where it was stored to prevent it from drying completely, its coarse texture and dark colour revealing the mixture of grains that went into its making. Wheat flour remains expensive enough that most peasant bread contains substantial amounts of barley, oats, and sometimes peas ground, fine enough to bind with the precious wheat that provides both nutrition and status. With the bread, you consume a small piece of cheese made from the milk of your family's single goat, its sharp flavour concentrated by the aging process that preserves dairy products through seasons when fresh milk is scarce. This cheese represents weeks of careful tending, milking the goat twice daily, straining and curdling the milk, pressing the curds, and monitoring the aging process that transforms simple milk into food that can sustain a family through winter months when fresh provisions become impossible to obtain. Old Henrik shares a portion of his meal with young Martin, whose family struggles to provide adequate nutrition for growing children. This casual generosity reflects the complex web of mutual obligation that binds medieval communities together. Henrik knows that his own survival during illness or injury depends on community support, just as Martin's family will someday help others facing temporary hardship. These informal networks of assistance often determine who survives difficult seasons and who succumbs to the various catastrophes that regularly test peasant resilience. As you eat, conversation turns to the upcoming harvest season and the calculations that occupy every peasant mind during summer months. Will the grain ripen fully before autumn rains begin? Are there sufficient workers to complete the harvest quickly enough to prevent loss to weather or pests? How much of the crop must be reserved for next year's seed, for the Lord's portion, for the church tithe, and for the family's own survival through winter? These questions have no certain answers, but their consideration shapes every decision about current labour priorities and resource allocation. The afternoon work assignment requires moving from field preparation to the more delicate task of tending crops already growing in the domain's spring-planted sections. Here, barley and oats stand knee-high, their green stalks promising substantial yields if properly maintained through the remaining growing season. This work demands different skills than morning's groundbreaking, the ability to distinguish crop plants from weeds, to judge when growing grain needs additional cultivation, and to identify the early signs of plant diseases that can devastate entire fields, if not addressed promptly. Weeding represents one of agriculture's most crucial and tedious tasks, requiring workers to spend hours bent over growing crops, carefully removing competing plants, while avoiding damage to the grain that will feed the community through winter. Each weed pulled successfully increases the final harvest yield, while each weed overlooked competes with food crops for soil nutrients, water, and sunlight. This work tests both physical endurance and sustained attention to detail, demanding the kind of patient persistence that characterizes all successful peasant labor. The tools required for weeding differ from morning's groundbreaking implements: smaller hoes with narrow blades designed for precision work, hand tools for close cultivation around individual plants, and sharp knives for cutting particularly stubborn weeds whose roots resist simple pulling. These specialized implements represent significant investments for peasant families, their purchase requiring careful saving, and their maintenance demanding constant attention to prevent rust, dulling, or breakage that could cripple agricultural productivity. As your work gang moves toward the afternoon's assignment, you pass through sections of the domain where other crops reveal the complexity of medieval agricultural planning. Kitchen gardens near the manor house grow the herbs and vegetables that supplement grain-based diets: onions, leeks, cabbages, and various herbs whose medicinal properties make them as valuable as their nutritional contributions. These gardens require daily attention from workers who understand the specific needs of different plants and the timing required to maximize yields from small spaces. The afternoon sun beats down with increasing intensity as you begin the careful work of crop cultivation. This labor demands a different rhythm than morning's vigorous groundbreaking, slower, more deliberate movements that allow for precise discrimination between valuable crop plants and unwanted competition. Your eyes must constantly evaluate the growing grain, identifying potential problems before they become serious threats to the harvest that will determine whether Little Wickham faces abundance or scarcity in the coming year. The medieval day continues its ancient rhythm, each hour bringing tasks that connect individual effort to collective survival, personal labor to community prosperity, and current work to the seasonal cycles that have governed agricultural communities for countless generations. Your afternoon unfolds according to patterns older than memory, as reliable and demanding as the passage of seasons themselves. As the afternoon progresses, your work carries you toward the edge of the domain fields, where cultivated land meets the ancient forest that stretches beyond sight into the green depths of England's remaining wilderness. This boundary represents more than a simple transition between cleared and wooded land. It marks the edge of human civilization, the frontier between the ordered world of agriculture and the mysterious realm where different laws apply, where different dangers wait, and where the very air seems thick with possibilities both wonderful and terrifying. The forest edge reveals itself gradually as you work your way across the field. Each row of cultivation bringing you closer to the towering oaks, ash, and beech trees that have stood here since long before Norman conquerors reshaped English society. These ancient giants dwarf the largest structures in Little Wickham, their massive trunks requiring the embrace of 4 grown men to encircle, their canopies creating cathedral spaces where sunlight filters through layers of leaves in patterns that shift and dance like living things. Your weeding work becomes more challenging near the forest boundary, where competition from woodland plants creates constant pressure on cultivated crops. Wild roses send thorny canes reaching into the grain fields, their sweet flowers and autumn hips providing beauty and nutrition but threatening to overwhelm domesticated plants with aggressive growth. Bracken ferns unfurl their prehistoric fronds in spaces where forest soil meets field earth, creating tangles that harbour both useful medicinal plants and the small creatures that can devastate growing crops. The sounds of the forest reach across the boundary into agricultural space, the liquid song of a blackbird defending territory from a high branch, the rustle of unseen creatures moving through undergrowth too dense for human passage, the whisper of wind through leaves that creates a constant background murmur like distant conversation in an unknown language. These sounds remind you that the ordered world of peasant agriculture exists within a larger realm governed by forces older and more powerful than human intention. Walter the Reeve approaches your work gang with visible uneasiness as you labour near the forest edge. Recent reports from neighbouring villages tell of increased wolf activity, packs made bold by successful hunting in deep woods now venturing closer to settled areas in search of easier prey. While wolves rarely attack healthy adults, they pose constant threats to livestock, children, and travellers caught alone after dark. The forest that provides essential resources also harbours dangers that require constant vigilance and collective defence. Among the workers, conversation turns to the practical relationship between village life and woodland resources that makes the forest simultaneously essential and threatening. Aldrich the swineherd will soon drive the manor's pigs into the forest edges to feed on acorns and beechnuts, a practice called pannage that provides crucial autumn nutrition for animals destined to supply winter meat. This annual migration into woodland margins requires careful timing and armed guards to protect valuable livestock from predators that view domestic pigs as convenient meals. The forest provides materials essential to peasant survival, but available only to those willing to venture into its green shadows and navigate the complex laws governing woodland use. Fallen branches can be gathered for fuel, but living trees belong to the Lord, and cutting them without permission brings severe punishment. Certain berries, nuts, and medicinal plants can be harvested by peasant families, but other forest products remain reserved for aristocratic use or require special permits that few villagers can obtain. Edmund's son shares knowledge passed down through generations about reading forest signs that indicate safety or danger. Unusual silence among birds suggests the presence of large predators, while excessive chattering might indicate human intruders whose intentions could be hostile. The condition of animal tracks in forest paths tells experienced observers whether wolves have passed recently, whether deer are moving in normal patterns, or whether strange men have been traveling through woodland areas where honest folk rarely venture. As you work closer to the tree line, your tools occasionally strike objects that reveal the forest's ancient history. Worked flint appears in the soil, artifacts left by people who lived in these woods long before Norman conquest, before Saxon settlement, before Roman legions carved the first roads through English wilderness. These stone tools remind you that countless generations have struggled to wrest survival from this landscape, each leaving traces of their efforts buried in earth that continues to yield both sustenance and mystery. The boundary between field and forest also marks important legal distinctions that affect every aspect of peasant life. Within the cultivated area, you work under manor law administered by Sir Geoffrey and his officials. Beyond the tree line, different authorities hold sway. Forest law enforced by royal officials whose jurisdiction extends across vast woodland areas, canon law governing church properties scattered through the wilderness, and the ancient customs that guide interactions with hermits, outlaws, and other marginal figures who live outside normal feudal structures. Margaret tells stories heard from her husband about the hermit who lives deep in the forest, a holy man who retreated from worldly concerns to pursue spiritual perfection in woodland solitude. Peasant families sometimes seek his counsel during times of crisis, carrying offerings of food in exchange for prayers, blessings, or herbal remedies prepared from forest plants whose properties he has learned through years of contemplation and experimentation. His presence reminds you that not all who dwell beyond civilization's edge represent threats to settled communities. The afternoon light filtering through forest canopy creates patterns that shift and change as leaves move in woodland breezes, casting moving shadows across the field edge where you labor. These shadows seem to carry messages from the green depths beyond, hints of the complex life that continues in spaces where human control barely penetrates. Birds call from deep woods, their voices carrying news that only they can understand, their songs weaving together reports of food sources, territorial boundaries, and the presence of creatures that share the forest realm. Young Martin works with increased nervousness as the forest looms closer, his imagination populated by the stories that older villagers tell about woodland dangers and mysteries, tales of travelers who entered the forest at sunrise and emerged days later with no memory of their time among the trees, of lights that dance between ancient trunks on moonless nights, of voices that call from empty clearings where no human throat could produce such sounds. These stories serve practical purposes, discouraging dangerous exploration while acknowledging the forest's power over human imagination. The forest edge also marks seasonal boundaries that govern agricultural timing and peasant survival strategies. In spring, the woodland canopy controls how quickly soil warms in fields that border wooded areas, affecting planting schedules and crop development. Summer brings different challenges as forest creatures venture into fields seeking water during dry periods, requiring guards to protect growing crops from deer, rabbits, and other animals whose hunger makes them bold enough to risk human proximity. As your work gang completes its assigned section near the forest boundary, you understand more clearly the delicate balance that governs peasant existence. The same forest that provides essential resources also harbors threats that could destroy individual families or entire communities. The boundary between cultivation and wilderness represents not just a geographical division, but a fundamental tension between human ambition and natural forces that shapes every aspect of medieval life. The shadows lengthen as afternoon moves toward evening, and the forest seems to breathe with the quiet patience of something that has watched countless human generations struggle to carve ordered lives from ancient wilderness. Your day's labor near this boundary reminds you that civilization itself remains a fragile achievement, maintained only through constant effort and collective vigilance against forces that could reclaim cleared land within a single generation of neglect. As the afternoon sun begins its descent toward the western hills, Walter the Reeve signals the end of fieldwork and directs your gang toward the village centre, where different obligations await. The transition from agricultural labour to other forms of work reflects the complex economy that sustains medieval communities, an intricate web of specialised skills, shared resources, and mutual dependencies that transforms raw materials into the tools, shelter, and necessities that make peasant survival possible in a world without industrial manufacturing or global trade networks. The heart of Little Wickham reveals itself as you walk toward the cluster of workshops and storage buildings that represent the village's artisanal economy. Here, craftsmen whose skills command respect and slightly elevated social status transform the products of agricultural labour into goods essential for community survival. The sound of their work creates a different rhythm than field labour, the steady ring of hammer on metal from Godwin the smith's forge, the rhythmic scrape of plane on wood from Crispin the carpenter's workshop, the soft thud of mallet on leather from Agnes the cordwainer's workspace. Godwin's smithy occupies a stone building designed to contain the fire that represents both creative power and constant danger in a community where most structures are built of wood and thatch. The forge itself glows with heat that transforms iron into tools, horseshoes, nails, and the countless metal objects that make agricultural life possible. The smith's knowledge encompasses not only the techniques of metalworking, but also the properties of different iron sources, the precise temperatures required for specific tasks, and the mystical aspects of a craft that seems to transform base metal into objects of almost magical utility. The bellows that feeds Godwin's forge requires the labour of his young apprentice, whose careful attention to the rhythm of airflow determines whether iron reaches the perfect heat for working or overheats into uselessness. This apprenticeship represents one of the few paths by which peasant children can escape agricultural labour. Though it demands years of unpaid service, constant attention to dangerous processes, and mastery of skills that require both physical strength and intellectual precision. Inside the smithy, the air shimmers with heat that makes every surface dance and waver like water. The scent of burning charcoal mingles with the acrid smell of heated metal and the sulphur odour that rises when iron reaches forging temperature. Godwin works with movements that appear effortless but represent decades of experience, judging heat by colour alone, shaping metal with precise hammer blows that ring against anvil in patterns recognisable to other smiths across Europe, quenching finished pieces in water that hisses and steams with each immersion. The products of Godwin's craft surround you as you enter the smithy: ploughshares that break earth for next season's crops, horseshoes that protect the hooves of animals, essential to transportation and heavy labour, knives whose sharp edges make possible everything from food preparation to leatherworking, and nails whose availability determines whether buildings stand strong or collapse under weather's assault. Each piece represents hours of skilled labour applied to expensive raw materials, making iron goods precious enough that peasant families treasure and maintain metal tools with religious devotion. Crispin the carpenter works in a different medium, but with equal skill, transforming timber from the forest into objects that shelter and serve the community. His workshop holds the complex geometry of medieval construction: wooden joints cut with precision that requires no nails, beams calculated to bear specific loads, and the intricate knowledge of wood properties that determines which trees provide the best material for particular purposes. Oak for strength, ash for flexibility, pine for lightness, each species offering qualities that skilled craftsmen exploit in creating structures designed to last for generations. The carpenter's tools represent a substantial investment in specialised equipment: saws whose teeth are hand-filed to precise angles, chisels sharpened to edges that can pare wood shavings thin as paper, planes that smooth rough timber to surfaces suitable for fine joinery, and measuring devices that ensure accuracy in construction projects where small errors compound into structural failures. These tools pass from master to apprentice through generations, their handles polished smooth by countless hands, their metal components maintained with care that borders on reverence. Agnes the cordwainer practices the ancient craft of leather working, transforming animal hides into shoes, belts, harnesses, and other goods essential to medieval life. Her workshop carries the distinctive scent of tanned leather, the sharp smell of the oak bark used in the tanning process, and the various oils and treatments that preserve leather goods against moisture and wear. The process of creating leather from raw hides requires months of careful treatment, timing that must account for seasonal weather patterns, and the availability of materials like oak bark that can only be harvested at specific times of year. The cordwainer's craft demands knowledge that spans biology, chemistry, and artistry, understanding which animals produce the best leather for different purposes, knowing how long hides must soak in tanning solutions, judging when leather has reached the proper flexibility and durability. These skills develop through years of apprenticeship and experience. Agnes also possesses the aesthetic judgment required to create leather goods that serve practical needs while displaying the decorative elements that mark quality craftsmanship. Your afternoon obligations include assisting these craftsmen with tasks that require additional labour but not specialised skills. At Godwin's forge, you operate the bellows that maintains forge temperature while he shapes a new ploughshare for the domain fields. The work demands constant attention to the fire's needs. Too little air and the iron fails to reach working temperature. Too much and the metal overheats and becomes brittle. The rhythm of bellows operation becomes almost meditative, your movements coordinated with the smith's hammer blows in a partnership that transforms raw materials into finished tools. The bellows themselves represent sophisticated technology adapted to medieval manufacturing needs. Constructed of leather stretched over wooden frames, they channel air through carefully designed valves that maintain steady pressure, while allowing the operator to work with sustainable effort. The leather must be maintained with oils that keep it flexible. The wooden frames require periodic repair, and the metal valves need regular cleaning to prevent obstruction of airflow. Working alongside Godwin provides glimpses into the broader economic networks that connect Little Wickham to distant communities. The iron he works comes from mines perhaps 50 miles away, transported by pack trains that follow ancient roads connecting resource areas to manufacturing centres. The charcoal that fuels his forge is produced by specialists who live in temporary camps deep in the forest, slowly burning wood under controlled conditions that produce fuel hot enough and clean enough for metalworking. The smith's knowledge extends beyond his immediate craft to encompass understanding of trade routes, seasonal price fluctuations, and the political conditions that affect the availability of raw materials. A war between lords can disrupt iron supplies for months, while good harvests in distant regions might increase demand for agricultural tools and raise prices for finished metalwork. These economic calculations influence not only Godwin's prosperity, but the entire village's access to essential metal goods. As afternoon shadows lengthen across the village centre, the coordinated work of various craftsmen creates a complex symphony of productive activity. The ring of Godwin's hammer provides percussion for the steady scrape of Crispin's plane, while Agnes's mallet adds softer counterpoint to the mechanical rhythm of grinding stones and spinning wheels operated by other village artisans. This orchestration of human effort transforms raw materials into finished goods through processes that have evolved over centuries to maximize both efficiency and quality. The apprenticeship system that governs craft education creates pathways for social mobility while ensuring the preservation of essential skills across generations. Young people who display aptitude for particular crafts can escape the limitations of agricultural labour, though their training requires years of unpaid service and mastery of complex knowledge that demands both intellectual capacity and physical capability. These opportunities remain limited, with most peasant children destined for lives similar to their parents, but they provide hope and incentive for families willing to sacrifice immediate labour contributions for long-term advancement. Your participation in craft production connects you temporarily to economic networks that extend far beyond Little Wickham's boundaries, revealing the sophisticated systems of specialisation and exchange that sustain medieval civilization despite its apparent simplicity and isolation. As evening approaches and the craftsmen begin to secure their workshops for the night, a second messenger arrives at Little Wickham with news that sends ripples of unease through the village community. This rider bears different insignia than the morning's messenger, royal colours that command immediate attention and herald communications from authorities whose power extends far beyond local manor boundaries. His horse shows signs of hard travel, foam-flecked and breathing heavily from a journey that has clearly been urgent and prolonged. Sir Geoffrey emerges from his manor house to receive the royal message personally, his usual composure replaced by visible tension as he breaks the wax seal and studies the parchment's contents. The gathered villagers watch from respectful distances, reading meaning in their lord's expression and posture as he absorbs information that will inevitably affect every family in Little Wickham. Medieval communities learn to interpret such moments carefully, understanding that news from the broader world often transforms local life in ways both immediate and lasting. Walter the Reeve approaches the small crowd of workers and craftsmen who have gathered near the village centre, his weathered face bearing the grave expression that accompanies difficult news. The royal summons requires Sir Geoffrey to provide additional men-at-arms for military service, along with increased grain contributions to support armies being assembled for campaigns whose purpose and destination remain unclear to peasant communities, far from royal courts where such decisions are made. The military summons affects Little Wickham in ways that extend far beyond simple numbers of men required for service. Edmund's eldest son, already trained in basic weapon use as part of his feudal obligations, will likely be selected for military duty that could take him away from the village for months or even years. His absence will strain his family's ability to maintain their agricultural responsibilities while reducing the community's available labour force during crucial seasons when every pair of hands contributes to collective survival. Margaret receives this news with the stoic acceptance that characterises peasant responses to circumstances beyond their control. But her eyes betray the fear that accompanies any separation of families in an age when communication across distances depends on chance encounters and irregular messengers. Military service offers opportunities for advancement and plunder that could improve a family's circumstances, but it also carries risks of injury, disease, or death that could destroy household economies, built on careful balances between labour and resources. The increased grain requisitions pose equally serious challenges for a community already calculating carefully to ensure adequate food supplies through the coming winter. Sir Geoffrey must balance royal demands against local survival needs, knowing that excessive compliance with royal summons could lead to famine conditions that would devastate his manor's population and productivity. These calculations involve not only current harvest projections, but also estimates of seed grain requirements, livestock feeding needs, and the various other demands that compete for agricultural production. As darkness begins to settle over Little Wickham, the village grapples with news that transforms the predictable rhythms of agricultural life into something more uncertain and potentially dangerous. The broader political forces that have seemed distant and largely irrelevant to daily peasant concerns now intrude directly into local planning and family security. Wars between lords, royal ambitions, and territorial disputes that play out in distant courts suddenly demand contributions from communities whose primary concern has been surviving another season of agricultural labour. Old Henrik shares memories of the last time royal summons disrupted village life, when men left for military service and never returned, when grain requisitions left families subsisting on bread, made from bark and roots ground together to stretch inadequate supplies. His stories serve as both warning and guidance, reminding younger villagers of strategies their ancestors used to survive periods when external demands threatened local stability. The evening meal in peasant cottages takes on different meaning as families confront the possibility of reduced numbers around their tables and diminished resources to support those who remain. Conversations that might normally focus on tomorrow's work assignments or seasonal planning now turn to questions about which young men might be selected for military service, how reduced labour forces will manage essential agricultural tasks, and whether current food stores can sustain increased contributions to royal demands. Godwin the Smith faces particular pressures as military preparations require weapons and armour that strain his workshop's capacity while competing with agricultural tool production that normally occupies much of his time. The iron required for military equipment commands higher prices than agricultural implements, but the smith must balance potential profits against community needs for ploughshares, horseshoes, and other tools essential to local survival. The royal summons also raises questions about timing that could prove crucial to Little Wickham's prosperity or survival. If military service removes workers during harvest season, crops that represent months of careful cultivation could be lost to weather or pests. If grain requisitions occur before harvest completion, families might be forced to surrender food needed for winter survival. These temporal pressures add urgency to agricultural planning that was already constrained by weather patterns and seasonal limitations. Agnes the cordwainer contemplates increased demand for leather goods required to equip men selected for military service, while also worrying about her nephew who might be among those chosen for royal service. The leather working that has provided steady income for her family could become more profitable during military preparations, but personal concerns about family members outweigh economic opportunities in a community where individual prosperity means little without collective security. As night deepens over the village, conversations in cottage doorways and around dying fires reflect the mixture of resignation and apprehension that accompanies major disruptions to established patterns of life. Peasant families have survived countless such challenges over generations, adapting to external demands while maintaining the essential work of agricultural production that sustains both local communities and the broader feudal structures that govern medieval society. The stars emerge overhead with the same constancy that has guided agricultural work for countless generations, but their familiar patterns now illuminate a community facing changes that could reshape the careful balances between labour and survival, individual families and collective welfare, local needs and external obligations. Little Wickham prepares to adapt once again to forces beyond its control, drawing on reserves of resilience and mutual support that have carried peasant communities through previous crises. Young Martin listens to adult conversations with the mixture of excitement and fear that marks adolescence confronting the possibility of dramatic change. Military service could offer adventures and opportunities unavailable in agricultural life, but it could also mean separation from family, exposure to dangers he has never imagined, and responsibilities that would transform him from village youth to soldier in the service of causes he does not fully understand. The approaching storm of external demands settles over Little Wickham like gathering clouds, promising changes that will test the community's ability to maintain the delicate equilibrium between survival and service, between local needs and broader obligations that defines existence in the medieval world, where individual lives remain subject to forces as unpredictable and potentially devastating as the weather that governs agricultural seasons. Dawn arrives grey and subdued over Little Wickham, as if the very sky reflects the sombre mood that has settled over the village during the night. You rise from restless sleep to find that conversations have continued in cottage doorways well past the usual bedtime. Families wrestling with decisions that could determine their survival through the coming seasons. The comfortable rhythms of agricultural life that have governed your existence seem suddenly fragile. threatened by forces that transform predictable hardship into something far more uncertain and dangerous. Sir Geoffrey has spent the night in consultation with Walter the Reeve and his household officials, calculating how to meet royal demands without destroying the community that generates his own wealth and authority. The mathematics of feudal obligation prove complex and unforgiving. Too few men sent for military service risks royal displeasure and potential punishment, while too many could leave insufficient labour to complete the harvest that feeds everyone through winter months. The manor bell rings earlier than usual, calling all able-bodied men to gather in the open space before the manor house, where selections for military service will be made according to criteria that blend feudal law, practical necessity, and the Lord's judgment about which villagers can best be spared from agricultural duties. You join the group of men whose ages and physical condition make them candidates for military service, feeling the weight of collective anxiety as families watch their sons, husbands, and fathers await decisions that could reshape household economies built over years of careful planning. Walter the Reeve stands beside Sir Geoffrey, holding a wooden tablet bearing scratched marks that represent each family's obligations, resources, and current circumstances. These crude records encompass complex calculations about labour requirements, military duties, and the various competing demands that determine how village manpower can be allocated without destroying the agricultural foundation that supports everyone's survival. Edmund's eldest son stands among the candidates with the resigned expression of someone who has already accepted that his selection seems inevitable. His combination of youth, strength, and basic weapons training makes him an obvious choice for military service, while his family's circumstances, his father's essential role operating the mill, his mother's skill in managing household resources, suggest they might survive his temporary absence better than families with fewer advantages. Young Martin also waits among the potential selectees, his 14 years making him barely eligible for military service. But his recent growth and demonstrated capacity for hard work marking him as a possible candidate. His selection would devastate his family's already precarious circumstances, removing their primary source of current labour while offering uncertain prospects for future advancement through military achievement. The selection process itself reflects the careful balances that govern feudal society, as Sir Geoffrey must weigh royal demands against local survival needs while maintaining the loyalty and productivity of his peasant workforce. Each man chosen for military service represents not only a soldier provided to royal armies, but also a gap in local labour that must somehow be filled by remaining workers whose own tasks already strain their physical capabilities. Godwin the Smith receives exemption from military service due to his essential role in maintaining agricultural tools and producing weapons required for local defence. His specialised skills make him too valuable to lose, while his age and physical condition, shaped by years of heavy labour at the forge, make him less suitable for military campaigns that favour younger, more agile fighters. The selection criteria reveal the complex social calculations that determine individual fates in medieval communities. Married men with children receive consideration for exemption based on family responsibilities, while unmarried young men find themselves preferred candidates for military service. Essential craftsmen and workers whose skills cannot easily be replaced gain protection from selection, while general labourers whose work can be distributed among remaining villagers become more likely targets for military duty. Sir Geoffrey announces his decisions with the formal gravity that accompanies exercises of feudal authority, his words carrying the weight of law that cannot be appealed or modified according to personal preferences. Edmund's son receives the expected summons for military service, along with 2 other young men whose families possess sufficient resources to survive their absence and whose physical capabilities suggest they might contribute effectively to royal military objectives. Martin receives unexpected reprieve when Sir Geoffrey judges that his family's extreme poverty would make his selection tantamount to condemning his elderly mother and younger siblings to starvation during the coming winter. This calculation reflects not mercy, but practical understanding that destroying peasant households through excessive military demands ultimately weakens the manor's economic foundation and reduces future capacity to meet royal obligations. The selected men must prepare for departure within 3 days, gathering personal belongings, arranging for family responsibilities to be transferred to remaining household members, and receiving basic military equipment provided by manor resources. This compressed timeline allows little opportunity for emotional preparation or detailed planning, forcing families to confront sudden separations with whatever resilience they can summon from previous experiences of loss and adaptation. Agnes the cordwainer receives orders to produce leather goods required to equip the selected men, sword belts, knife sheaths, and protective gear that will help keep village sons alive during military service, whose dangers and duration remain unknown to their families. Her work takes on personal urgency as she crafts items that might determine whether neighbours return safely or join the countless soldiers whose bones fertilise distant battlefields. The manor's grain stores face systematic evaluation as officials calculate how much surplus can be provided to meet royal requisitions without compromising local survival through winter months. These assessments require precise knowledge of consumption rates, storage capabilities, and the various competing demands that claim portions of agricultural production before any surplus becomes available for external obligations. Families of selected men begin the painful process of redistributing responsibilities and resources to maintain household functionality despite reduced labour forces. Edmund's wife must assume greater responsibility for mill operations while managing her domestic duties, drawing on skills and knowledge accumulated through years of supporting her husband's work. Other families face similar challenges as they adapt to sudden changes in their fundamental survival strategies. The village community responds to these disruptions with the mutual support networks that have sustained peasant settlements through countless previous crises. Neighbours offer assistance with agricultural tasks that exceed remaining family members' capabilities, while informal arrangements emerge for sharing resources and coordinating labour to ensure that essential work continues despite reduced manpower. As the selected men contemplate their approaching departure from Little Wickham, they face the prospect of experiencing a world beyond the agricultural boundaries that have defined their entire existence. Military service will expose them to different landscapes, unfamiliar peoples, and forms of conflict that bear little resemblance to the cooperative labour that characterises village life. The emotional weight of these separations settles over Little Wickham like a heavy blanket, muffling the usual sounds of daily activity and replacing familiar routines with the anxious preparations that accompany major disruptions to establish patterns of life. Yet beneath this surface disruption, the essential rhythms of agricultural survival continue, as crops still require tending and animals still need care, regardless of the human dramas that unfold around them. It's the third morning, and you find the village transformed by an undercurrent of finality that permeates every corner of Little Wickham. The selected men move through their familiar spaces with the deliberate attention of people memorizing details they may never see again, touching door frames and pausing at field boundaries as if storing sensory memories against an uncertain future. The rhythm of normal life continues around these preparations. Chickens still need feeding. Cows require milking. Bread must be baked. But everything carries the weight of impending separation. Edmund's eldest son, Thomas, sits outside his family's cottage, methodically sharpening his father's old knife, while his mother packs cloth strips for bandages and a precious cake of soap wrapped in oiled leather. These preparations represent more than practical necessity. They constitute a mother's desperate attempt to extend her protection beyond the physical boundaries of home equipping her son with tangible reminders of family care that might sustain him through experiences she cannot imagine or influence. The manor courtyard fills with activity as Sir Geoffrey's household officials distribute military equipment that represents significant investment in the success of men whose survival directly affects Little Wickham's future obligations to royal authority. Each selected villager receives a spear with iron point, a wooden shield reinforced with metal studs, and a quilted gambeson that provides basic protection against weapons, while remaining light enough for extended marching. These items carry the weight of feudal expectation. They mark their bearers as Sir Geoffrey's men, representatives of his honour and effectiveness in meeting royal demands. Walter the Reeve oversees the distribution of provisions that must sustain the men during their initial journey to join larger military formations, gathering at designated assembly points throughout the kingdom. Hard bread, salted pork, and dried peas represent careful calculations about nutritional requirements balanced against transportation limitations, and the expectation that royal logistics will assume responsibility for feeding soldiers once they join official military units. You observe how the village women navigate this morning with particular grace under pressure, managing both increased domestic responsibilities and the emotional labour of supporting departing family members without revealing their own fears about uncertain futures. Agnes the cordwainer delivers her finished leather goods, sword belts crafted with extra care, knife sheaths reinforced against heavy use, and protective gear that represents her contribution to keeping village sons alive in circumstances she has never experienced but can vividly imagine. The departing men undergo a transformation as they don their military equipment, their familiar identities as farmers and craftsmen becoming overlaid with the unfamiliar role of soldiers in service to distant authorities. Thomas adjusts his gambeson and tests his grip on spear and shield, movements that suggest he is rehearsing for experiences that contrast sharply with the agricultural labour that has shaped his physical development and mental expectations about how strength should be applied to solve problems. Young Martin watches these preparations with relief, tempered by survivor's guilt, his narrow escape from selection leaving him acutely aware of the arbitrary nature of the forces that determine individual fates in feudal society. His continued presence in Little Wickham means increased responsibilities as he helps fill gaps left by departing workers, but also the burden of witnessing how easily lives can be disrupted by demands that originate far beyond local control or understanding. Sir Geoffrey addresses the selected men with formal words that attempt to frame their military service as both feudal obligation and opportunity for advancement. Though everyone present understands that survival represents the primary achievement available to peasant soldiers whose noble commanders view them as expendable resources rather than individuals with inherent value. His speech emphasizes honor, duty, and service to the realm, while carefully avoiding specific discussion of the dangers, hardships, and mortality rates that characterize medieval military campaigns. The village priest offers prayers and blessings that acknowledge divine authority over human fate, while providing spiritual comfort to families confronting separations whose duration and outcome remain entirely uncertain. His words invoke protection and safe return, while implicitly recognizing that many young men who leave their villages for military service never return, their bones scattered across distant battlefields whose locations their families will never know or visit. As the morning progresses, you witness the complex emotional choreography that governs medieval farewells. Families express love and concern through practical actions. Mothers inspect equipment. Fathers offer final advice about survival and conduct. Siblings share private jokes that create bonds of memory to sustain relationships across unknown distances. These rituals serve multiple functions, providing emotional outlet while maintaining the stoic demeanour that feudal society expects from all social classes during times of crisis. The selected men gather their personal belongings in cloth bundles that represent everything they can carry from their previous lives into an unknown future. These possessions reflect individual personalities and priorities. Thomas includes a wooden cross carved by his grandfather. Another man packs dried herbs his wife gathered for healing, while the youngest selectee carries a smooth stone from Little Wickham's brook that provides tangible connection to the landscape that shaped his identity. Godwin the smith provides final adjustments to weapons and equipment, his experienced hands ensuring that spear points remain securely fastened and shield reinforcements will withstand combat stress. His work takes on ceremonial significance as the village's master craftsman imparts his skill to protect men who represent not only individual lives, but also Little Wickham's investment in fulfilling feudal obligations that determine the community's relationship with higher authorities. The departure itself occurs with less ceremony than the preparations might suggest, as if prolonging the moment of separation would only increase emotional difficulty for everyone involved. The selected men form a small column on the village road, their military equipment creating unfamiliar silhouettes against the familiar landscape of fields and cottages that has defined their entire existence until this transformative moment. Family members line the roadway to offer final embraces and words of encouragement, but these interactions carry undertones of finality that reflect everyone's awareness that military service frequently results in permanent separation from home communities. Mothers touch their sons' faces as if memorizing features that time and distance might blur, while fathers offer hand clasps that communicate years of unspoken affection and pride, alongside practical advice about survival in circumstances they themselves have never faced. Sir Geoffrey rides beside the departing men for the first portion of their journey, his presence providing both ceremonial escort and practical protection during the initial stages of travel through territory, where his authority offers some security against bandits and other threats that plague medieval roads. His participation in their departure demonstrates the feudal bond that connects lord and peasant through mutual obligation, even as it emphasizes the hierarchical nature of relationships that determine how individual lives can be disposed of to serve larger political purposes. The sound of their footsteps fades gradually as the small military column moves beyond the village boundaries, leaving behind families who must now adapt to altered circumstances, while maintaining the agricultural productivity that justifies their continued existence within feudal structures. The men carry with them not only personal hopes for survival and eventual return, but also Little Wickham's collective investment in meeting royal demands without destroying the community that generates wealth and stability for everyone within the manor's boundaries. As their figures disappear around a bend in the road, you feel the village settling into a new configuration of relationships and responsibilities, like water finding its level after stones have been removed from a stream. The departure represents both ending and beginning, the conclusion of one phase of community life and the commencement of adaptations that will test Little Wickham's resilience against challenges that extend far beyond the familiar hardships of agricultural survival. The morning continues with its necessary tasks, but everything carries the weight of absence and transformation, as if the very air has become thinner with the departure of familiar voices and familiar hands that contributed to the complex web of cooperation that sustains rural medieval life against the constant pressure of forces that threaten individual and collective survival. You wake to discover that Little Wickham has settled into an uneasy rhythm during the weeks following the departure of its young men, the village adapting to reduced labour forces through careful redistribution of tasks and subtle modifications to agricultural practices that reflect the community's resilience in the face of imposed hardships. The harvest continues under circumstances that demand longer working days and more intensive cooperation between households. Yet the essential work progresses with the determined efficiency that characterizes peasant survival strategies developed over generations of similar challenges. The first unsettling change arrives not through dramatic announcement, but through the gradual recognition that Martha, the widow who tends several households' laundry, has been absent from her usual rounds for 3 consecutive days. Her cottage, normally alive with the sounds of scrubbing and the sight of drying linens, stands silent, with smoke no longer rising from its chimney. When Agnes the cordwainer ventures to check on her neighbour's welfare, she discovers Martha confined to her bed with a fever that has left her weak and delirious, muttering about strange dreams and complaining of pain that seems to move through her body like water flowing through channels. The news of Martha's illness spreads through Little Wickham with the swift efficiency that characterises village communication networks. But her condition initially receives interpretation as merely another instance of the various ailments that periodically afflict members of rural communities whose lives expose them to countless sources of physical stress and environmental hazards. The harvest season traditionally brings increased incidents of exhaustion, minor injuries, and the respiratory complaints that accompany long days of labour in dusty fields under variable weather conditions. Yet within days, Martha's illness reveals characteristics that distinguish it from familiar seasonal ailments. Her fever intensifies, rather than breaking, accompanied by a persistent cough that produces blood-tinged sputum and leaves her gasping for breath between episodes of violent spasms. More disturbing still, dark swellings appear in her neck and armpits, growing larger and more painful as her condition deteriorates, with alarming speed that suggests forces beyond the usual range of village healing remedies. Edmund's wife, experienced in treating common ailments with herbal preparations and traditional remedies, visits Martha's cottage to offer assistance, but finds herself confronting symptoms that resist familiar treatments and seem to worsen despite her careful ministrations. The patient's condition deteriorates with a relentless progression that transforms a respected community member into a suffering stranger whose ravings and physical deterioration create fear among neighbours who have never witnessed such rapid and dramatic decline in someone previously known for robust health. The village priest arrives to offer spiritual comfort and last rites, his presence confirming what many residents have begun to suspect, that Martha's illness represents something more serious than the seasonal complaints that periodically circulate through rural communities. His prayers invoke divine protection against pestilence and evil influences, words that acknowledge the supernatural explanations. Medieval minds apply to diseases whose causes remain invisible and incomprehensible according to contemporary medical understanding. Martha's death occurs on the 7th day of her illness, a timeline that shocks villagers accustomed to ailments that either resolve within days or develop into chronic conditions that persist for months or years. The speed of her decline suggests malevolent forces that operate according to principles entirely different from familiar patterns of sickness and recovery, creating anxiety about whether similar fates might await other community members who shared her living spaces or participated in her daily activities. The disposal of Martha's body presents unprecedented challenges for a community whose traditions surrounding death assume natural endings to lives that have run their expected courses. Her rapid deterioration and the mysterious nature of her final illness create concerns about whether normal burial practices might somehow spread whatever malevolent influence caused her untimely demise, forcing village leaders to balance respect for the deceased against protective measures for the living. Sir Geoffrey consults with the village priest about appropriate procedures for handling Martha's remains, their discussion reflecting the intersection of feudal authority, religious doctrine, and practical concerns about community health that characterize medieval responses to unexplained deaths. The decision emerges to proceed with traditional burial rites while maintaining careful distance from the deceased and burning personal belongings that might harbour whatever force transformed a healthy woman into a corpse within a single week. The funeral occurs with subdued ceremony that reflects both grief for a valued community member and anxiety about the circumstances of her death. Fewer villagers attend than would normally gather for such occasions, while those who do participate maintain greater physical distance from the burial site and leave immediately after the essential rituals conclude. The usual post-funeral gathering, where community members share memories and offer comfort to grieving relatives, does not occur, leaving Martha's death to resonate through Little Wickham with unresolved emotional weight. Within days of the funeral, young Peter, who helped Edmund operate the mill, begins experiencing similar symptoms: fever, cough, and the ominous swellings that marked Martha's final illness. His condition develops with the same frightening speed that characterized the widow's decline, confirming villagers' worst fears that her death represented not an isolated tragedy, but the beginning of something that threatens the entire community's survival. The recognition that disease has established itself within Little Wickham's boundaries creates a crisis that tests the community's cohesion and traditional survival strategies. Families begin isolating themselves from neighbours, reducing the social interactions that normally provide emotional support and practical cooperation during difficult periods. The careful networks of mutual assistance that have sustained the village through countless previous challenges suddenly appear as potential channels for spreading whatever malevolent force has begun claiming lives with unprecedented efficiency. Agnes, the cordwainer, finds her trade disrupted as fewer customers venture forth to conduct normal business, while those who do seek her services maintain careful distance and handle her products with obvious reluctance. The informal economy of favours, shared labour, and resource exchange that supplements formal feudal obligations contracts dramatically as households prioritise isolation over cooperation in desperate attempts to protect family members from whatever influence has begun devastating their community. The harvest work continues, but under circumstances that require extensive modifications to traditional practices as workers attempt to maintain agricultural productivity while minimizing contact with potentially contaminated individuals or environments. Tasks that normally involve close cooperation between multiple households become individualized efforts that strain family resources and reduce overall efficiency, creating concerns about whether sufficient food can be gathered and preserved to sustain the community through winter months. Edmund's wife assumes increased responsibility for mill operations as young Peter's condition deteriorates, her work complicated by fears about whether the grain processing that provides essential services to multiple households might somehow facilitate the spread of disease throughout the community. The mill's central role in village life makes it impossible to suspend operations, yet its function as a gathering point for residents from various households creates anxiety about whether it serves as a nexus for whatever malevolent influence has begun claiming lives. The psychological impact of disease spreads through Little Wickham even faster than the physical symptoms, as residents confront the possibility that their familiar world of predictable hardships and manageable challenges has been invaded by forces that operate according to entirely different and far more dangerous principles. The security provided by traditional knowledge, established relationships, and proven survival strategies suddenly appears inadequate against threats that transform healthy neighbours into corpses within days, while leaving no clear indication of how such fates might be avoided. As you observe these developments, you recognise that Little Wickham faces a crisis that extends far beyond the temporary disruptions caused by military service or seasonal variations in agricultural productivity. The community confronts an invisible enemy that attacks without warning, shows no respect for social boundaries or individual virtue, and operates according to principles that render traditional defensive measures ineffective against its relentless advance through the population. Little Wickham is gripped by fears that extend far beyond the physical symptoms of disease, as the community's collective imagination begins weaving explanations for calamities that resist comprehension through familiar frameworks of understanding. The deaths of Martha and young Peter have created a psychological vacuum that fills rapidly with ancient superstitions, whispered accusations, and desperate searches for someone or something to blame for afflictions that seem to strike without pattern or mercy. Old Maud, The village wise woman, whose knowledge of herbal remedies and traditional healing practices has sustained her reputation for decades, finds herself viewed with increasing suspicion as neighbors begin questioning whether her knowledge of beneficial plants might extend to harmful substances as well. The same expertise that once made her invaluable during childbirth complications and seasonal illnesses now appears potentially sinister to minds seeking explanations for deaths that defy conventional understanding of how sickness operates within rural communities. The timing of disease's arrival, following so closely upon the departure of village men for military service, creates fertile ground for theories about supernatural causation that connect these separate events through invisible threads of malevolent influence. Whispered conversations in cottage doorways suggest that forces beyond human understanding have targeted Little Wickham for punishment, though disagreement persists about what transgression might have provoked such devastating retribution from powers that remain hidden yet clearly hostile. Agnes the Cordwainer reports strange sounds emanating from the forest that borders the village's cultivated fields. Howls that carry tones unlike those produced by familiar wolves, accompanied by crashing noises that suggest creatures of unusual size, moving through undergrowth with apparent disregard for stealth or caution. These disturbances occur primarily during hours of darkness when honest folk remain safely within their cottages, yet their volume and persistence penetrate even the stoutest walls to remind sleeping villagers that the boundaries between civilization and wilderness remain permeable to influences that respect no human authority. Sir Geoffrey receives disturbing reports from his counterparts in neighbouring manors, messages that describe similar outbreaks of disease, accompanied by sightings of unusual creatures and unexplained phenomena that suggest widespread disruption to the natural order that normally governs rural life. These communications arrive through networks of noble correspondence that connect feudal lords across substantial distances, yet carry information that proves consistently troubling in its implications about threats that transcend local boundaries. A travelling merchant, one of the few outsiders willing to risk contact with communities known to harbour disease, brings news of greater turmoil affecting the kingdom's stability at the highest levels of authority. He speaks of conflicts within the royal court, between advisors who favour military solutions to current crises and those who advocate diplomatic approaches to problems that may require supernatural rather than political remedies, suggesting that even royal authority struggles to comprehend and address the forces currently destabilising established social order. The merchant's accounts describe widespread reports of unusual animal behaviour throughout the kingdom, livestock refusing to enter certain fields, horses becoming unmanageable when approaching specific locations, and domestic animals displaying levels of agitation that suggest their senses detect threats imperceptible to human awareness. These disturbances accompany the spread of disease with such consistency that learned men at court have begun investigating possible connections between supernatural influences and the physical ailments that devastate communities across the realm. Brother Thomas, the monk who serves multiple villages in the region, arrives in Little Wickham carrying holy relics and blessed oils intended to provide spiritual protection against whatever malevolent forces have established themselves within the community's boundaries. His presence offers comfort to residents desperate for authoritative reassurance, yet his obvious anxiety and the trembling of his hands during religious ceremonies suggest that even representatives of divine authority feel uncertain about their ability to combat threats that operate according to principles that transcend conventional religious understanding. The monk's attempts to consecrate the village and protect its residents through ritual purification reveal the complex intersection of Christian doctrine and older beliefs that continue to influence medieval rural communities despite centuries of official religious instruction. His prayers invoke protection from demons and evil spirits, alongside appeals for divine mercy, acknowledging that supernatural threats require responses that blend established Christian practices with folk traditions that predate organized religious authority. During his blessing of the mill, Brother Thomas discovers strange markings carved into wooden support beams, symbols that appear recently made, yet follow patterns that suggest knowledge of traditions far older than Christian influence in the region. These mysterious signs create additional anxiety about whether Little Wickham has become the target of deliberate supernatural attack, orchestrated by individuals who possess forbidden knowledge about summoning malevolent forces to afflict innocent communities. The discovery of similar markings on other buildings throughout the village intensifies suspicions about internal threats to community safety. As residents begin scrutinizing neighbors for signs of involvement with practices that might have attracted supernatural retribution. Old Maud faces particular scrutiny due to her knowledge of traditional healing methods that some now interpret as potentially dangerous, dabbling with forces that proper Christian folk should avoid entirely. Edmund's wife reports seeing strange lights moving through the forest during the darkest hours before dawn, illuminations that pulse with colors unlike those produced by normal fires and seem to move with purpose rather than drifting randomly according to natural air currents. These sightings occur with sufficient frequency to rule out simple imagination, yet their eerie qualities resist explanation through familiar understanding of how light behaves in natural environments. The village priest struggles to maintain spiritual authority while confronting challenges that exceed his theological training and practical experience with parish management. His sermons increasingly focus on themes of divine testing and the importance of maintaining faith during periods of tribulation. Yet his obvious distress during private conversations suggests that he questions whether conventional religious remedies prove adequate against threats that seem to mock established spiritual protections. News arrives through Sir Geoffrey's networks about similar crises affecting noble houses throughout the kingdom, with reports of entire family lines succumbing to mysterious ailments while their castles become sites of unexplained phenomena that terrorize surviving retainers and drive away potential successors. These accounts suggest that whatever forces currently threaten Little Wickham operate on scales that encompass the entire social hierarchy, rather than targeting only peasant communities whose destruction might serve political purposes. The psychological pressure of living under constant threat of invisible dangers begins affecting village social dynamics in ways that threaten the cooperative relationships essential for community survival. Families become increasingly suspicious of neighbors whose behavior deviates from expected patterns, while traditional gatherings and shared activities diminish as residents prioritize individual household security over collective social bonds that normally provide emotional support during difficult periods. As autumn deepens and the harvest nears completion, under circumstances that demand extraordinary effort from reduced labor forces, you observe how Little Wickham struggles to maintain its essential functions while confronting threats that challenge every assumption about how rural communities can protect themselves against forces that transcend human understanding. The familiar rhythms of agricultural life continue, but overlaid with constant awareness that malevolent influences lurk beyond the edges of cultivated spaces, waiting for opportunities to extend their devastating reach into the heart of human civilization. The approaching winter assumes ominous significance as villagers contemplate surviving the season's isolation while harboring diseases and supernatural threats that show no respect for the natural cycles that normally govern rural existence. The security once provided by familiar routines and established relationships appears increasingly fragile against enemies that strike without warning and operate according to principles that render traditional defensive measures ineffective against their relentless advance. You wake to the sound of hoofbeats approaching Little Wickham, at an hour when honest travellers rarely venture along country roads, the urgent rhythm suggesting messengers bearing news that cannot wait for daylight hours or normal courtesies of rural hospitality. The approaching winter has already begun asserting its authority over the landscape, with morning frost coating the remaining unharvested crops, and reminding everyone that seasonal deadlines approach regardless of the various crises that have disrupted normal agricultural schedules throughout the autumn months. Sir Geoffrey emerges from his manor house still fastening his cloak as the messenger dismounts, his horse lathered with sweat that speaks of hard riding across considerable distances. The news he carries arrives in fragments of breathless speech that gradually coalesce into a coherent account of military disaster that has befallen the royal forces to which Little Wickham contributed its young men just weeks earlier, though the time frame now feels like years given everything that has transpired within the village boundaries since their departure. The Battle of Evesham has ended in catastrophic defeat for royal forces, with thousands of English soldiers falling to Welsh longbows and cavalry charges that broke through defensive lines with devastating effectiveness. The messenger's account describes a battlefield littered with the bodies of men who left their villages as representatives of feudal obligation, only to perish in conflicts whose strategic importance proves meaningless compared to the personal tragedies their deaths create for families who will never learn the specific circumstances of their final moments. Thomas, Edmund's eldest son, appears among the confirmed casualties listed in the messenger's dispatch. His name recorded alongside hundreds of others whose deaths represent not merely military statistics, but the destruction of carefully constructed household economies and family relationships that required years to establish and cannot be quickly replaced. The news transforms abstract fears about military service into concrete grief that will reshape every aspect of daily life for his surviving family members and the broader community that depended on his labour and future contributions. The other young men from Little Wickham remain unaccounted for in the aftermath of battle, their fates lost in the chaos that follows military disasters when surviving soldiers scatter across unfamiliar territory seeking safety, while wounded men lie unattended on battlefields that become scavenging grounds for local populations seeking useful equipment among the dead. The absence of definitive information about their survival creates a torment of uncertainty that proves almost as difficult to endure as confirmed news of death. Sir Geoffrey faces the grim task of informing families about losses that extend beyond personal tragedy to encompass broader implications for Little Wickham's future capacity to meet feudal obligations and maintain agricultural productivity with reduced labour forces. The death of young men represents not only individual grief, but also economic disaster for households whose survival strategies depended on their continued contributions to family welfare and community cooperation networks. Edmund's reaction to news of his son's death demonstrates the stoic endurance that characterises peasant responses to losses that cannot be prevented or remedied through individual action. His grief expresses itself through intensified focus on mill operations, as if maintaining essential services for the community provides both distraction from personal pain and meaningful contribution to collective survival during circumstances that threaten everyone's continued existence within established social structures. The messenger brings additional troubling news about the spread of disease throughout the kingdom, with reports of entire villages abandoned as populations flee areas where mortality rates approach 50% of total inhabitants. These accounts describe scenes of social collapse that exceed even Little Wickham's current difficulties, offering grim perspective on how much worse circumstances could become if the community fails to develop effective responses to threats that show no signs of diminishing without decisive intervention. Brother Thomas receives instructions from ecclesiastical authorities to begin organising mass burial sites for communities where individual graves cannot accommodate the volume of dead bodies that accumulate faster than surviving populations can manage through traditional funeral rites. These preparations acknowledge that normal religious practices prove inadequate when death occurs on scales that overwhelm established customs and require modifications to doctrine that prioritize practical necessity over ceremonial completeness. The approach of winter assumes particular urgency as villagers confront the prospect of surviving the season's isolation while managing grief, disease, and reduced labour forces simultaneously. The harvest has been completed through extraordinary effort, but stored grain supplies reflect the diminished productivity that results from working with fewer hands during crucial periods, when timing determines the difference between adequate nutrition and starvation during the months ahead. Agnes the cordwainer faces increased demand for her services as families prepare for winter conditions that will test their resourcefulness and resilience against challenges that compound existing difficulties with additional hardships related to weather, reduced mobility, and the psychological stress of prolonged confinement within household boundaries. Her work takes on heightened importance as communities recognize that quality equipment and clothing can mean the difference between survival and death during extended periods of cold weather. The village priest conducts memorial services for Thomas and other young men whose deaths have been confirmed, though the absence of bodies creates emotional complications for families whose grief lacks the physical focus that normally provides structure for mourning rituals. These ceremonies attempt to provide spiritual comfort while acknowledging that traditional expectations about death and burial cannot be fulfilled under current circumstances that separate families from their deceased members permanently and completely. News filtering through noble networks describes widespread social unrest in urban areas, where populations blame government authorities for military failures and inadequate responses to disease, outbreaks that devastate communities, while royal courts remain isolated from the suffering their policies have contributed to creating. These reports suggest that the kingdom faces not merely military defeat, but potential political collapse as established authorities lose legitimacy among subjects who question whether feudal obligations deserve continued respect when protection and effective governance prove unavailable. Sir Geoffrey begins implementing emergency measures designed to preserve Little Wickham's essential functions through winter months that will test the community's survival capabilities under circumstances that exceed normal seasonal challenges. These preparations include rationing stored grain supplies, organizing shared labor arrangements that accommodate reduced household workforces, and establishing protocols for managing disease outbreaks that might intensify during periods of close confinement within inadequately ventilated living spaces. The psychological impact of confirmed military casualties combines with ongoing disease mortality to create levels of grief and anxiety that strain traditional support systems beyond their capacity to provide adequate comfort and practical assistance. Families that previously offered mutual aid during routine crises now struggle to manage their own immediate survival challenges while maintaining the social bonds that distinguish human communities from mere collections of competing individuals. Old Maud's status within the village undergoes rehabilitation as desperate circumstances force residents to prioritize practical knowledge over superstitious fears. Her expertise with herbal remedies and traditional healing methods becoming too valuable to reject based on unfounded suspicions about supernatural involvement. Her treatments prove more effective than religious ceremonies at alleviating suffering and providing tangible hope for recovery from ailments that respond to earthly rather than divine intervention. The approaching winter represents both threat and opportunity for Little Wickham. As seasonal isolation that normally challenges rural communities might also provide protection from external sources of disease and conflict that have devastated the broader region throughout the autumn months. The community's survival will depend on its ability to maintain internal cohesion while managing finite resources through months of confinement that will test every aspect of social cooperation and individual endurance. As you observe these developments, you recognize that Little Wickham stands at a critical juncture where the decisions made during the coming weeks will determine whether the community emerges from winter as a functioning social unit or joins the growing number of abandoned villages whose populations succumb to the multiple crises that have converged upon rural England with devastating effect during this particularly harsh year of widespread calamity and loss. You wake to discover that spring has arrived in Little Wickham, not with the dramatic flourish of renewed life celebrated in romantic tales, but through the gradual, almost imperceptible accumulation of small changes that mark the end of a winter that tested every assumption about human endurance and community survival. The village that emerges from months of isolation bears little resemblance to the thriving agricultural settlement that existed before disease, military disaster, and social upheaval transformed both its physical appearance and fundamental character through trials that would have destroyed weaker communities entirely. The population of Little Wickham has been reduced by nearly half through the combined effects of military casualties, disease mortality, and the departure of families who abandoned their holdings to seek better circumstances in regions less severely affected by the multiple crises that converged upon this particular corner of England. Yet those who remained have developed adaptations and innovations that demonstrate remarkable human capacity for survival under circumstances that initially appeared hopeless to minds accustomed to more predictable patterns of rural existence. Edmund continues operating the mill despite the death of his eldest son, his work now supplemented by young Martin, whose narrow escape from military service has transformed him from a marginal figure into an essential contributor to community survival. The partnership that has developed between the experienced miller and his unlikely apprentice represents one of many adaptive relationships that have emerged as Little Wickham reorganized itself around the reduced population and altered circumstances that define its current reality. Agnes the cordwainer has expanded her traditional leatherworking activities to include basic medical treatments, using knowledge acquired from Old Maud during the desperate months when conventional distinctions between different types of expertise became luxuries that threatened community survival. Her dual role as craftsperson and healer reflects the versatility that characterizes all successful survivors of the recent calamities, as specialized knowledge proves less valuable than adaptability to changing circumstances and willingness to assume unfamiliar responsibilities. The abandoned cottages that mark the sites of families who perished or departed serve practical functions within the reorganized village structure, providing storage space for communal resources and materials that support economic activities adapted to reduced population levels. Rather than standing as mournful monuments to loss, these empty buildings have been integrated into survival strategies that transform apparent symbols of defeat into useful components of recovery and adaptation to new realities. Sir Geoffrey has negotiated revised feudal obligations with royal authorities whose own circumstances have been sufficiently disrupted by widespread military defeats and social unrest to make them receptive to pragmatic adjustments that acknowledge changed realities throughout the kingdom. Little Wickham's military obligations have been suspended indefinitely in recognition of its population losses, while agricultural dues have been reduced to levels that reflect current productive capacity rather than historical precedents established under more favorable conditions. The spring planting occurs according to modified agricultural strategies that prioritize crops requiring minimal labor input, while providing maximum nutritional value for the reduced population that must sustain itself through another complete seasonal cycle. Traditional crop rotations have been simplified to focus on proven varieties that offer reliable yields under current management capabilities, abandoning more ambitious agricultural experiments that required larger workforces and greater risk tolerance than current circumstances permit. Old Maud has emerged as an unexpected figure of authority whose knowledge of traditional healing methods and practical wisdom about resource management has proven more valuable than the formal religious and secular authorities, whose expertise appeared inadequate when confronted with unprecedented challenges. Her elevated status within the community represents a broader transformation of social hierarchies that now prioritize practical competence over inherited position or conventional credentials. The village priest has adapted his religious practices to acknowledge the spiritual needs of a community that has experienced losses and challenges that exceed the explanatory capacity of conventional Christian doctrine as typically interpreted in rural parish settings. His sermons now blend official religious teaching with practical advice about survival strategies and community cooperation, recognizing that spiritual leadership must address earthly concerns when divine intervention appears insufficient to resolve immediate threats to collective welfare. News from the broader world arrives sporadically through traveling merchants and official messengers whose accounts describe a kingdom transformed by the same forces that reshaped Little Wickham, though with varying degrees of success in developing adaptive responses to unprecedented challenges. Some regions have achieved remarkable recovery through innovative approaches to social organization and resource management, while others have experienced complete social collapse and abandonment of previously thriving settlements. The surviving young men from Little Wickham's military contingent begin returning home as royal authorities abandon attempts to maintain large standing armies whose logistical requirements exceed available resources in a kingdom devastated by military defeats and widespread disease outbreaks. These veterans bring knowledge of the broader world that extends village perspectives beyond local boundaries, while contributing practical skills acquired through military service that prove valuable for community defense and resource management. The psychological resilience that enabled Little Wickham's survival through its worst crisis has created social bonds and cooperative relationships that prove stronger and more flexible than the traditional feudal obligations that previously governed community life. The shared experience of confronting existential threats has forged a collective identity based on mutual dependence and proven competence rather than inherited social positions that may prove irrelevant under changed circumstances. As summer approaches, you observe that Little Wickham has achieved a form of stability that differs fundamentally from the security it possessed before the multiple crises that tested its survival capabilities. The current equilibrium rests on demonstrated adaptability, practical knowledge, and social relationships proven through extreme adversity rather than the traditional certainties that once seemed permanent but proved fragile when subjected to unprecedented stress. The village now functions as a community of survivors who understand that their continued existence depends on maintaining the innovations and cooperative spirit that enabled them to overcome challenges that destroyed other settlements throughout the region. This hard-won wisdom about the fragility of civilized life and the importance of community solidarity provides foundation for a future that may prove more resilient than the past, though at the cost of innocence about how quickly familiar worlds can be transformed by forces beyond individual control or prediction. The lessons learned through survival of disease, military disaster, and social upheaval have created a community that possesses realistic understanding of human vulnerability, alongside proven capacity for adaptation to circumstances that initially appeared to threaten complete destruction. Little Wickham's recovery demonstrates that even the most severe challenges to community survival can be overcome through collective effort, practical innovation, and the stubborn human refusal to accept defeat when alternatives remain possible through cooperative action and mutual support. As you witness the continuation of daily life in this transformed village, you recognize that history consists not merely of the dramatic events celebrated in chronicles and songs, but of the countless small acts of courage, adaptation, and mutual aid that enable ordinary people to survive extraordinary circumstances and preserve the possibility of human community, even when traditional structures prove inadequate to protect the values and relationships that make survival worthwhile rather than merely possible.
If you're still awake, then I'd wonder why. Let me know in the comments why. Maybe you'd need a more gentle, soothing sound. Well, hopefully next time. Next time, we'll venture somewhere new. Perhaps we'll explore the hidden rituals of ancient civilizations, or maybe we'll uncover the secrets buried in forgotten libraries. Until then, carry with you this reminder. Every comfort you enjoy, every freedom you take for granted, was paid for by countless generations who endured far more than we'll ever know. Sweet dreams, if you can manage them. And remember, The past is always watching, always whispering its lessons to those brave enough to listen. Until next time.